We are going live to Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, where Lindsey Graham's casket is now being brought into the rotunda moments from now. Let's listen in.
Ready, step. 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 Forward, more.
I want to bring in Mark McKinnon, former advisor to both George W. Bush and John McCain, David Rode, MS Now senior national security reporter, and Michael Schnell back with us, MS Now congressional reporter on the Hill. Michael, what are we expecting to see in this Capitol Rotunda ceremony? Because we're going to hear from, obviously, the president, John Thune, Fox News personality, Sean Hannity, those who are very, very close to Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, Steph, it's an emotional day up here on Capitol Hill, particularly for members of Congress who have served alongside Lindsey Graham for decades. But it's also a day of celebration. Somebody who dedicated his life to public service. Lindsey Graham first started serving in the United States Senate in 2003. Before that, he represented South Carolina in the House, and then before then in the State House. So he is somebody who really dedicated decades of his life to public service. As you mentioned, as this ceremony gets underway in the Capitol Rotunda, we're going to be hearing from John Thune and Vice President J.D. Vance, two people who served alongside Lindsey Graham. After that, his casket will head to National Cathedral, where his funeral will take place. We'll hear remarks from President Trump then. And then tomorrow he heads back to South Carolina one final time to the State House, in addition to a church. And of course, Lindsey Graham leaves a void as he is leaving Washington, as he's leaving South Carolina, particularly up on Capitol Hill, he was somebody who was seen as the Trump whisperer, somebody who folks would go to understand how President Trump was thinking about a particular matter, someone who President Trump would go to hear about the dynamics in the Senate GOP conference. And then, of course, there's this void that he leaves on the world stage, which should not be understated because he dedicated his public service career to promoting a muscular U.S. foreign policy on the world stage. He's somebody who very much so was central to pushing President Trump to join Israel and striking Iran back in February, which has led to this war. He is somebody who was so supportive of Ukraine and was constantly in President Trump's ear about that matter. And look, it is a void that he is leaving, but his legacy is certainly not lost up here on Capitol Hill. Later today, the Senate is going to take the first procedural vote on a bill to slap sanctions on both Russia and Iran. This is a matter that Lindsey Graham has been working on for months. There were a number of starts and stops, but there was finally this compromise. It's going to be named in his honor, that piece of legislation. And the last thing I'll leave you with, Steph, is there was a report in Axios that shortly before Lindsey Graham passed away, he joked that he couldn't die yet because he still needed to slap sanctions on Russia. He needed to see through the war in Iran. I think that he would be smiling knowing that this Russia-Iran sanctions bill is going to start making its way through Congress on the day of his funeral.
Mark, Lindsey Graham was a complicated political figure. I mean, even his relationship with Donald Trump, deeply complicated, but also consequential. What made him that?
Well, he was a politician from Central Casting. He was kind of like a Mickey Rooney character. And so, and I mean that sort of in the best and the worst ways about politicians. I mean, he was a true public servant. I think that was a good characteristic in him. But he also was really needed relevance, which is why he saw the shift to supporting Donald Trump the way that he did, which complicates his legacy for sure. I got to know him when I worked for John McCain, and he was part of the Three Amigos group with John McCain and Joe Lieberman.
Yeah, I'm guessing he and John McCain are having very complicated conversations right now.
Absolutely.
If they are in the same place,
it's interesting.
unclear.
It's interesting because even given where Lindsey's gone kind of on Iran, he would make McCain look like a dove right now. But the one interesting story about him, when I was around him during that period of McCain's presidential campaign, is that he was advocating for something that could have been so historically consequential, which was the notion that John McCain should consider Joe Lieberman to be his vice president.
Lindsey Graham was advocating for
He
this.
was a huge advocate for it. He loved Joe Lieberman. But the problem was, and the irony was, that the reason that it didn't happen was because Lindsey loved to talk. He talked about it to the press. It got leaked out to the press. It became public. And then, of course, there was huge pushback from the GOP powers on McCain saying that'd be crazy to do that. You know, half the convention would walk out, which I think would have been great, because it would have so reinforced his message about country over party to pick Lieberman, who had been a Democrat and was an independent. But it was both something he advocated for and ultimately blew up because he was such a loudmouth.
That's extraordinary. We're going to take a quick break. Our coverage of Senator Graham's funeral ceremony continues in 90 seconds. Don't go anywhere.